The total liberation of Crimea began to take shape not through an immediate ground invasion, but through a sequence of direct strikes against Russia's logistical lifelines. This Wednesday, May 6, 2026, Ukraine began to cut off ferries, landing ships, arsenals, depots, and routes that kept Russian troops supplied. Between the Kerch Strait, Sevastopol, and the occupied land corridor in southern Ukraine, the message is simple. Before trying to recover the territory, Kyiv wants to leave Crimea isolated, suffocated, and too expensive for Putin to maintain. I'll tell you all about this in a moment, but right now you'll want to be subscribed to the channel to stay well informed with real-time information at the highest journalistic quality ever seen, with Milson Alves' standard of credibility. The main point now is that Ukraine is not just attacking out of revenge. It is mounting a patrician campaign against everything that allows Russia to remain in Crimea. On the night of April 5th to 6th, 2026, Ukrainian military intelligence units claim to have used drones to disable the Slavyansk railway ferry, described by Kyiv as the last railway ferry still operating in the Kerch Strait to support Russian forces on the peninsula. This vessel was used to transport equipment, fuel, and military cargo for the occupation. Without it, Russia would become more dependent on the Crimean bridge and on land routes that are more exposed to Ukrainian drones. Days later, the pressure increased in Sevastopol. On April 19th, Ukraine claimed to have put out of action two large landing ships of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Yamal and the Nikolai Filchenkov. The Yamal could carry up to 500 tons of cargo, including armored vehicles and troops. The Nikolai Filchenkov had a capacity of 1,000 tons. According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, both were important assets for amphibious landings and for Russian military support in Crimea, with total losses estimated at over $150 million. That's when the total liberation of Crimea stops being just political rhetoric and starts to look like a step-by-step military campaign. Ukraine is attacking what Russia needs to stay. Transport, ammunition, fuel, ships, ferries, command centers, air defense, and depots. The goal isn't just to cause damage. It's to turn every Russian soldier on the peninsula into someone increasingly cut off from reinforcements, resupply, and a safe escape. So far, in the most recent attacks against Slavyania, Yamal, and Nikolai Filchenkov, there is no reliable public death toll confirmed by independent sources. The main impact announced was logistical and military. Disabled vessels, reduced transport capacity, and increasing pressure on the Crimean bridge. This information is important because it shows the type of war that Kyiv has chosen at this moment. It's not about announcing an immediate entry of troops into the peninsula, but about weakening the occupation from within until the Russian presence becomes burdensome, vulnerable, and difficult to sustain. Crimea is the most sensitive point of the war because it was there that Putin built one of the greatest showcases of modern Russian power. The peninsula was illegally annexed in 2014 after Russian forces took over buildings, communications, and strategic points amid the political chaos in Kyiv. Since then, Moscow has treated the region as a military base, a national symbol, and a platform to control the Black Sea. Sevastopol, home of the Black Sea Fleet, became the center of Russian operations against Ukraine since the large-scale invasion in 2022. That's why the Ukrainian offensive against Crimea carries more weight than isolated attacks. When Kyiv hits ships in Sevastopol, ferries in Kerch, and depots along the occupied routes, it is targeting the idea that Crimea is untouchable. Putin took the peninsula to project power in the Black Sea. Now Ukraine is trying to show that this same territory can become a logistical trap for the Kremlin. The Crimean bridge appears as the next major pressure point. The structure connects mainland Russia to the peninsula across the Kerch Strait and has always had both military and symbolic value. It helps Moscow move fuel, weapons, ammunition, and troops. If the ferries are destroyed or disabled, the bridge becomes even more important. And the more important it becomes, the more it turns into a target. The retired American general, the commander of the US Army. Ben recently stated that Crimea remains the decisive terrain in the war and that the Crimean bridge will eventually fall if Ukraine manages to isolate the peninsula. The Ukrainian calculation is tough but clear. First, prevent Russia from freely using Sevastopol. Then, reduce Russian air defenses on the peninsula. Next, cut off ferries, ships, and corridors. Finally, put pressure on the Kerch Bridge and force Moscow to supply Crimea through longer, more expensive, and more vulnerable routes in the occupied south of Ukraine. This sequence does not guarantee immediate liberation, but it creates the conditions for the Russian presence to start losing stability. In April, Ukraine's own Ministry of Defense presented the campaign of deep strikes as part of a larger effort. According to Kyiv, in addition to the ships in Sevastopol and the ferry in Kerch, Ukrainian operations also targeted refineries, terminals, vessels, aircraft, and centers linked to Russian military capability. The message is that the Russian rear is no longer secure. The war has started to reach structures that Moscow previously considered protected by distance. The moment also favors Kyiv because of Russian attrition at the front. In February 2026, Ukrainian forces regained more territory than they lost in the last 2 weeks of the month, something that hadn't happened since the 2023 counteroffensive. According to the analysis cited by the Kyiv Post, based on the Institute for the Study of War. After months of enemy pressure, Ukraine once again posted net territorial gains during some periods. At the same time, Russia is having difficulty replacing its losses. Al Jazeera reported that Moscow has not been able to replace all its losses since December, and that the pace of recruitment in the first quarter of 2026 was below the average needed to reach the announced annual target. This shortage of personnel directly affects Crimea, an isolated occupation with fewer ships, fewer ferries, less air defense, and fewer personnel replacements becomes more difficult to maintain. In the political field, Ukraine has also gained momentum. The European Union reached an agreement to unlock an urgent loan of 90 billion euros for Kyiv after Hungary lifted its veto. The measure came after the resumption of Russian oil flow to Hungary and Slovakia through the Druzhba pipeline and was regarded by Volodymyr Zelensky as the right signal at the present moment. This money helps Kyiv sustain defense, ammunition, military industry, and resistance in a long war. This financial boost is decisive because the liberation of Crimea does not depend only on courage. It depends on drones, missiles, intelligence, industrial production, air defense, ammunition, and the ability to attack repeatedly. An operation against the peninsula requires a patience and constant pressure. Ukraine needs to make every Russian resupply slower, every ship more exposed, and every route more dangerous. That's the difference between a symbolic attack and a real campaign of liberation. Recent history shows that Ukraine has been testing this strategy for years. In September 2023, Kyiv struck the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Russia admitted at least one missing serviceman, while Ukraine claimed a much greater impact. The AP highlighted that Crimea, illegally annexed in 2014, had become a frequent target precisely because it served as a support hub for the Russian invasion. This attack showed that Moscow's most important naval base in the Black Sea could no longer operate with the same ease as before. The history of Crimea itself explains why this territory defines conflicts far beyond its size on the map. In the 19th century, the Crimean War brought major European powers and the Russian Empire into conflict over control of the Black Sea and the balance of power surrounding the Ottoman Empire. Today, Kyiv tries to repeat this logic in a different way, not with an old imperial war, but with drones, missiles, and attacks on logistics against a modern occupation. Other nations also show that occupied or isolated territories can fall when their supply lines are cut. In military campaigns throughout history, islands, peninsulas, and enclaves became vulnerable when they lost ports, bridges, railways, and ruins. Crimea fits this logic because it depends on external connections to maintain troops, fuel, air defense, and ammunition. If Russia loses the ability to move cargo through Kerch, if Sevastopol comes under constant threat, and if the land corridor becomes a daily target for drones, Russian control will exist more in rhetoric than in actual security. Now, what comes next is a phase of continuous pressure. Ukraine should keep attacking ferries, ships, radars, air defense systems, depots, and fuel routes. It can also increase the pressure on the Crimea bridge, even if a new ground offensive is not yet on the immediate horizon. The likely goal is simple: to leave Russia with a few bad choices. Either Moscow concentrates more defenses on the peninsula and weakens other fronts, or it accepts that Crimea will become increasingly exposed. For Putin, the problem is that Crimea is not just an occupied territory, it has become a personal symbol of power. Losing the security of the peninsula would mean admitting that Russia's greatest geopolitical achievement since 2014 could be reversed. And for Zelensky, Crimea remains an essential part of Ukrainian sovereignty. Every ferry hit, every ship stopped, and every depot destroyed affects the image of control that Moscow has tried to project for more than a decade. I'm Milson Alves News, and my purpose is to keep you well informed with the truth every day. The news links are in the video description. Like this video, subscribe, and check the comments at the end to engage more with the Milson Alves community.